So a few months ago, I was thinking about what I might get my next talk on, and I was talking to somebody about how, well, all I'm really working on right now is stored procedure, something kind of boring. And he said, well, I don't really even know what a stored procedure is, and so I figured I would tell you all about that. My name is Kimberly Collins. I've been working with SQL Server for about 17 years. I know that several people here have worked with Postgres. I've worked with Postgres for approximately 0 years, and also MySQL. I believe that some of these things apply, but don't quote me on too much of that. You'll have to do your own research. But I can tell you all about SQL Server. My slides are at GitHub on my repo stored procedures. So what is a stored procedure? It's a procedure that's stored. I think when I first heard of them, I was hearing people say store procedure. I was like, I don't really know what a stored procedure is. Okay, so it's stored procedures. Now I'm like Googling the right thing. I don't know if anyone even was Googling way back then. But it's a procedure that's stored on your database server, in your database, for later execution. And it's a collection of SQL statements. You can have any number of input and or output parameters, none or some of each. You do need at least one SQL statement in your procedure. You can be selecting and or modifying data. You can have a bunch of statements. I don't want to admit how many hundreds of lines I've written in one stored procedure. You're going to be doing like one thing in this procedure. And if you hear me say SP, I'm talking about stored procedure. I've also heard people say SPROC, although not as common, but those are the two abbreviations you might hear for stored procedure. This is what the structure looks like when you're creating a procedure. Create procedure, the name of your procedure. Again, this could be totally blank. You don't have to have any parameters, but this is where they'll go. You'll give the name of your parameter and its data type. If it's output, you'll put the word output here. And then between the beginning and end, you will put whatever logic you want your procedure to do. As an example, here is a stored procedure that gets employee details for a particular employee ID that's given. So when you call this employee details SP, you need to tell it which employee ID or it won't work. So you're creating it as, you begin and end, and then here's where your actual code goes. I put select star, meaning everything, although a better practice would be to actually list out all the columns you need, but I don't want to save space. And you're probably joining from employees to maybe some other tables to go get things about that employee, like their manager's name, maybe you're calculating their current PTO balance. And so that's where you're going to have maybe a good amount of logic in the stored procedure. And then my where this is where the input parameter is being used. So that's an example of a stored procedure. When I was talking about gathering data, you might, if you know anything about database objects, have thought, well, that sounds a whole lot like a view. So a view is somewhat similar, but I want to contrast it with a stored procedure. A view is essentially a saved select statement. So it's kind of like a table. It looks like a table. You use it like a table, but it's virtual. There's not any real data being stored separately from your original tables. You cannot have variables. You can't have multiple statements, no input or output parameters. And when you use it, it's going to look like this: select star or whatever from your view name. And I'm not showing you what the view definition looks like. That would be somewhere else. And then your where, you're going to just put in a regular where statement like you would for a table. So I'm looking at this. I didn't even know that employee summary is a view. So in contrast, a stored procedure can have variables. You can have more than one SQL statement. You can modify data, where in a view you're just selecting. And you can have input and or output parameters. And so the difference is that for view, I'm selecting from something, whereas stored procedure, I'm executing this procedure to go do something. So you might be thinking, okay, this sounds a whole lot like a function, and really they are quite a bit similar to application code functions. You can kind of think of them in that way. A SQL Server function is different from a stored procedure. One difference is that a function will either return a single value or a table. It's not really intended to modify data, just like the view. A couple of built-in examples are getDate. So you probably, or this is a really commonly used one. So I'm not executing this, I'm selecting this. And then this is a table valued function. String split is another one that's built in. So I'm passing in some parameters here. It doesn't matter too much. This is just an example of like what this actually does. But it returns a value. And I could join these. I could use these inside of expressions in my SQL code. As opposed to the stored procedure, you can have output parameters. You can select data, but you don't have to. You don't have to return anything. And you can modify data. In a function, you can also, but you really shouldn't. It's not really intended to modify. It's intended to calculate or aggregate in some way. Whereas stored procedure can do that too, but it can also make modifications to data. So why use stored procedures specifically as opposed to your application code? I want to go through a few reasons where you might consider using a stored procedure. One of them is when you're aggregating data. So if you have a bunch of data that you're pulling into your application code to aggregate there, you might rethink, should we be doing this aggregation on the SQL side and only bring in the data that we need? Another time you might use a stored procedure is when you're batch processing. So again, if you're bringing in a lot of data to do something with that data in your application code, and maybe saving it back or doing some update to a lot of data at a time, instead of bringing all that data into your application, doing the work there, and then sending something back, just do it all in a stored procedure. One caveat to that is if the thing you're doing to this data uses application code, well, of course you need to bring it into your application. But if it's all an update or something you can do on the SQL side, consider doing that there. If you are joining a lot, and I have a link that obviously you can't click on right now, but you could if you got a hold of my slides on GitHub, I did give a talk on joins. And so if you search Techloma's YouTube channel for my name, Kimberly Collins, you'll find a talk I gave at this group a few years ago on joins. So you can join data in your application code, but if it's very complex at all, at least I personally, and this comes down to a personal preference. If I'm doing a lot of joining, I'd rather do it in the database code. I just feel more comfortable doing joins there as opposed to like my link code in C#. But this is another time when you might just think about, would it make more sense to do this work on the database side? If you have a set of multiple SQL statements that work together as a single unit of work, instead of, again, pulling data in, doing something with it in the application, and maybe based on that, getting more data, it's like, okay, could we just do all of this on the database side and do one procedure call instead of this network traffic back and forth? If you use a transaction in your SQL statement, in your stored procedure, you can ensure that the entire set either succeeds or fails as a single unit. The typical example of this is when you're moving money from one account to another. If one part of that fails, you need the whole thing to fail because you don't want the money to go into one account, but it didn't come out of the other, or vice versa. So that's when you're going to use a transaction in your stored procedure. You might be using a stored procedure if performance is an issue. So a couple of things, and I don't have time to talk about either of these. These will be great separate talks. Query plan caching and indexes are things that are on the database side. So in SQL Server, whenever you run a query, it comes up with the most efficient way to do that work. And that can be cached. And that's part of the benefit of a stored procedure is that your query plan is being cached for that stored procedure. So if the first time figures out, okay, what's the best way to do this work, and then saves that plan. So when you call that stored procedure over and over again, it knows what to do. And then indexes, again, a whole other talk we could talk about some other time about the benefits of looking at creating indexes for when you're getting your data on the SQL side. A couple of typical uses for stored procedures. Depending on your reporting solution, it's very common to have one stored procedure per report. So this report aggregates the data in some way, and so we just store that procedure, that logic, in the database. So depending on your solution, it's very common to see that. Calling from your backend code, the three scenarios are we use stored procedures never, we use them all the time, or something in between. So one downside of a stored procedure is now you have business logic in the database. And that may be again, we're talking about preferences here in our team's convention. Our team might be choosing not to do that for the reason that they want all of their business logic in the application code. And I have thoughts on that we could chat about some other time. But if that's the way your team is going, you might just want to continue with that, or you might say, oh, well, because these reasons before, the aggregation, the batch processing, all those things, can we consider, for this procedure, creating a stored procedure just for this one or this type of work. I've been more and more lately seeing teams using stored procedures for all of their data access, so all their CRUD, all their create, read, update, and delete, instead of using an ORM, which again I've given a talk on that you can go find. Instead of using an ORM like ND Framework, they say forget that. I've had bad issues with that in the past with previous versions. We're doing stored procedures for everything. So that's maybe a little bit more of an old school approach that I'm seeing people going back to recently. And then the in-between is we use an ORM like ND Framework to do our data access for the basic CRUD. We can just use application code. We're in the application. We're thinking in C# or whatever our language is. We might as well just keep using that. And then, as needed, when we're doing some sort of batch processing, for example, create stored procedures for those. So again, if you go to Techloma's YouTube channel, you can find the talk that I gave on object relational mapping. So the one that you'd be using in the .NET world is probably ND Framework. So I hope now when you hear the term stored procedure, you at least have a vague idea of what people are talking about. You have some idea of when you would use these or not, at least considerations to make. If you have any quick questions right now, I'll try to answer them off the top of my head. I'd probably rather, though, that you go to Techlahoma Slack and post to the databases channel. That way other people can see your question and answer it or see their answers. But again, you can find all this on GitHub, and you can message me in Slack if you have any questions. Thanks.